So there are a number of factors that have helped to push Central Asian states towards illiberal democracy in Kyrgyzstan at first, and then non-democracy, really in all the states. Everyone else immediately in Kyrgyzstan eventually. And within Kyrgyzstan, this only took a few years to happen. So the first one is legacy. And we've talked a lot about legacy, and really a lot of this class is about how the legacy has impacted post-Soviet Central Asia, because it's had an enormous importance for the development of the region. So starting with the legacy, the empirical record shows in general around the world that states react to their colonial legacy. For example, post-British states and post-British states in particular that had more than 1 million people living in them tend to be the ones that have the greatest continuity in democratic experience because they've inherited this British constitutional liberalism, the legacy of law, rule of law, administration, the administrative apparatus that the British set up. French colonies did a lot worse. So there's a difference there. Now looking at post-Soviet states, we find some variation. The Baltics went to liberal democracy. Most other states went illiberal democracy, and then or competitive authoritarianism, and then drifted towards outright authoritarianism, these non-democracies. And so among the non-democracies include Central Asia, so all 5 republics there, or countries now, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, Russia, Ukraine has flirted back and forth, Georgia's gone back and forth. Remember, there are huge challenges of economic transition. This might be one of the things that accounts for this. But they've also lacked a democratic experience, which may also account for this, and may explain why the Baltics did better than many of the other places in the post-Soviet Union. A second element here is constitutional design, which we talked about. Presidential systems may be more inclined to lean away from constitutional liberalism, because once they're elected, leaders see themselves as the quote-unquote true representatives, the only legitimate force. Remember, in a presidential system, leaders can avoid coalition building. They can avoid bargaining by going straight to the people. For example, holding referenda on particular issues that they find, that they think they can get the support of the population on, but not other legislators. So you've got a reduction in the checks and balances for those who aren't part of the 51% who voted for that president or whatever it is. And remember, in many of these Central Asian states, we're probably talking about a fairly it could well be a fairly small number of people that vote for the president. Now, as it turns out, I think in each and every case, the president tends to have lots of support for other reasons that we've talked about: the creation of this nationalist image, the control of the media, so that people don't really know about any other real alternatives, and other things that you see in traditionally non-democratic states. A third element here is economic stability. Remember, across the post-Soviet Union, you've got simultaneous political and economic reform. And these were things that had never been experimented with before. I mean, going from communism to free market capitalism, democracy, was a big experiment. And so this has been one big excuse. We, the Central Asian leaders, need to make decisions which necessitate sidestepping democracy for now. We don't have time for democracy. Again, democracy is a luxury. See South Korea, see Taiwan, their experiences. Empirically speaking, authoritarian and democratic leaderships have proven themselves equally good or bad at delivering goods. So there's not necessarily one system that works better than the others. Another factor here has been the divided societies, the demographics, the ethnicity. So democracy and democratization empirically can be quite risky. What we find is that democracies rarely fight wars with one another. Democratizing states tend to be less stable and more warlike than non-democracies. In other words, states that are going through a democratization process are much more likely to go to war than non-democratic states. So in divided societies, all the processes of democratization can lead to increased nationalism, that can lead to radicalism, which can result in violence, and especially warmongering as a tool used by political elites to consolidate power and rally supporters around the flag, whatever that flag may be. Now, as a foreign policy question, it's difficult to impose constitutional liberalism, especially in the short term, because it's complicated. It's a long-term process. When you think about democratization, the classic experience of Britain, well, that took a millennium, right? Was it a millennium? Yeah, well, okay, so it took a good 800 years, 700 years or so. So instead, what you find are more superficial changes, i.e. the label democracy, which are easier to achieve. And so we call ourselves democracies. We have these ceremonial elections. They might not be free, they might not be fair, but we go through the ceremony of democracy. And the reason the countries do this is because they're fashionable. They're a stamp of legitimacy that trickles down from the international level to the domestic level. On the international stage, if you're not democratic, well, you don't represent your people. So everyone pretends to be democratic, and everyone pretends to pretends to accept that for the most part. So looking at the fifth point here, the role of reference points and bandwagons. So here the argument has been that if you live around other democratic states, if all your neighbors are democratic, you've got a fairly high likelihood of going democratic yourself. In other words, the democratization experiment is going to turn out well for you, because you have a chance of joining their club, whatever club they're in. So the greater physical and cultural distance to Western Europe means the lower level of strategic interest from the West, and less movement to liberal democracy. And it's not just a question of the West, it's also a question of the rest. What do you have around you? If you look around Central Asia, well, what do they have? They've got Russia to the north. Well, that hasn't gone a very good direction. But arguably in the 1990s, they were going towards democracy under a very drunken President Yeltsin. But they were also imploding economically. And so Putin came to power, and Putin has maintained power since he came to power in 1999, and you've moved away from democracy. China, a Communist Party state. You've got, to the south, you've got Afghanistan. You've got Iran. And then, of course, you had Tajikistan within Central Asia. None of these were very appealing models. So all these could be used by new elites to justify their illiberal policies. And again, security being key among them. And as I pointed out before, many Central Asian leaders have pointed to, or maybe I'll point out tomorrow. I've done a lot of pointing this out, but Central Asian leaders tend to look at Tajikistan and say, we don't want to be like them. At least they did in the early 1990s. Another point here is previous democratic experience. The more democratic experience you had before, empirically speaking, the better chance you have of success in democratizing this time around, even if it's been a couple generations. Perhaps because of the human capital, memories stay alive. Even if they're older, though, you can have legitimizing effects on democratic institutions. So we can say, oh, well, this is how they did it back in the 1800s, and so now we can go back to our great tradition of democracy. Part of this is also, I think, a function of urbanization and education, which perhaps to contribute to participation and civic belonging. So Central Asia is still particularistic here, where you have lots of people living outside of urbanized areas and education being so fairly low. If you've got, it's great if you've got pre-existing structures like independent trade unions, shadow parties, other elements of civil society that existed in a prior democratic experience and can be reactivated. But Central Asia didn't have any of these things. And you need civil society to really make democracy move, especially in independent media or some sort of other watchdogs over the state. So the prior democratic experience was also lacking here. If you look over here at mass political culture, when we talk about a democratic civic mass culture, we're talking about participation, citizen responsibility, all these things. But how do you encourage these? Well, they're based on trust at the horizontal level between the citizens, and also trust between the citizens and the institutions, so this vertical level that we've talked about. The legitimacy of others' claims to rights have to be accepted. There has to be a feeling that you have the ability to influence government policies when you need to. Otherwise, democracy just doesn't work. And there's evidence that culture is somewhat malleable, but there's a lag. In other words, you can be transformed from a passive political culture to a more activist, more democratic political culture, one participatory in nature. But there tends to be a lag, a generational lag. So it takes a generation or two to make these changes from a political culture perspective. And so it suggests that this isn't so much about changing the most hardened, those with the longest experience, or those with the most experience in the former system, or the true believers in communism, but rather giving up on them and waiting them for them to die out. So you're investing in the future. But in many places, you can't actually invest in this future because education is controlled by members of the old regime. And again, around Central Asia, Who's in charge in all these places? Well, the old Communist Party heads are still in charge in many of these places. So political culture is difficult to transform. And finally, we've got the nature of mass expectations here. In a newly democratizing state, or in many newly democratizing states, you actually find that people aren't crazy about democracy because there's a perception that the government in a democracy is incapable of dealing with the numerous political and socioeconomic problems facing the state. Look at things that we've talked about, the risk of violence, whether ethnic or organized crime or just petty violence. This deepens grievances among the losers. It intensifies fears of liberalization among the winners, those who are actually earning from the liberalization process, in other words, prospering, but then they lose security. And so all this reduces the chance for political compromise between the various actors. You've got endless bickering in Parliament and the chance that the government's going to change frequently in parliamentary democracies. Especially where you've got a transition gap, people are only going to endure material hardships when they see that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Otherwise, you're going to have disillusionment and this anti-democratic stance because political economic changes are going forward simultaneously in this region. So where people find an economic downturn on personal terms, well, then they're going to attribute this to democracy in general. That's what we've seen. So all these things, the nature of mass expectations also suggests that democracy was going to be a rough ride because people were experiencing a simultaneous political and economic transformation, and the economic transformation was incredibly painful. And the economic transformation was painful in every post-communist state, but more painful in some than others. So I'll take I'll stop here.